The air was heavy with rot, buzzing with the sound of countless wings. In the middle of a stagnant swamp, lashed between two hollowed wooden shells, a man's body swelled grotesquely under the merciless sun. His skin, once smooth, now blistered and cracked, was alive with motion, tiny creatures burrowing, crawling, feeding, where flesh had split open. The stench was unbearable, a foul mixture of milk-turned sour honey fermented in the heat, human waste, and the sweet sickly odour of decay that clung to everything around him. And yet he still breathed. His chest rose in shallow, painful rhythm. His eyes, bloodshot and swollen, still moved, darting weakly toward any sign of mercy that would never come. Day after day he had endured this waking nightmare, his voice reduced from screams to rasping whispers, his humanity stripped away piece by piece. He was no longer simply dying, he was being unmade, consumed slowly by the earth's smallest executioners, flies, beetles, worms, things too small to name. To the guards it was no longer a man they looked upon, but a spectacle, a warning, a lesson carved into living flesh. Imagine the horror of being conscious, unable to move your body, transformed into a banquet for vermin. Each bite a needle of fire you could not escape. Imagine thirst so fierce your tongue cracked and swelled until it filled your mouth, while water glistened just beyond your reach. Imagine the heat of the sun baking your skin by day, the cold mist rising from the marsh at night, the constant itch, sting and gnaw that robbed you even of the mercy of sleep. For 17 days this was his reality. His name was Mithridates. Once he had walked the polished floors of a Persian court, dressed in silks, a man of privilege who believed himself untouchable. Now he was reduced to this, a breathing carcass, stretched out for insects and men alike to feast upon. Each new dawn was not a gift but a curse, a reminder that death was not yet finished with him. And yet his survival itself became its own legend, whispered in awe and terror. How could any man endure such torment for so long? The story of Mithridates' death is one of the most grotesque executions ever conceived, an act not of swift justice, but of deliberate methodical cruelty. It was called scaphism the boats. It was designed not merely to kill, but to erase every shred of dignity, to turn life itself into a cage of agony. Even in the darkest annals of history, few punishments rival its savagery. So how did a courtier, a man of wealth and favour, end up in this swamp condemned to such a fate? What mistake, what word, what act sealed his doom? That answer lies not in the swamp itself, but in the gilded halls of Persia, in the whispers of power, envy, and a single careless boast. Before the swamp, before the boats, before the buzzing swarm, there was the palace. The empire of Artaxerxes II stretched vast and unyielding from the valleys of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Persia, a realm where kings ruled not by compromise but by divine right. Within these gilded walls, courtiers like Mithridates lived lives that seemed untouchable. Marble columns soared above tiled floors, polished to a mirror's sheen. Perfumed gardens bloomed with roses and lilies, and fountains spilled endlessly, their water sparkling in the desert sun. The air was thick with incense music and the laughter of nobles who believed themselves safe beneath the shadow of the throne. Here, luxury was both armour and trap. Each banquet glittered with gold goblets brimming with wine, as dancers moved like flames, their anklets chiming with every step. Silken cushions, jewelled plates, and meats spiced with saffron and cinnamon covered the long tables. And yet, beneath the sweetness of honeyed figs and the fragrance of burning myrrh, there was always the sour taste of fear. For in Persia, the higher a man rose, the closer he stood to the king's gaze, and the closer he stood to ruin. Mithridates thrived in this world. He was not born a king nor a conqueror, but a courtier, a man whose fortune depended not on the strength of armies, but on his tongue, his wit, his ability to please. He had stood in the presence of princes toasted victories beside generals and brushed shoulders with men whose names would be carved into history. To be summoned by the king was not unusual. It was his life. He was known, trusted, and for a time perhaps even admired. Yet in these marble corridors, loyalty was a currency easily spent and easily questioned. Everyone wore masks, the smile at a feast, the bow in the throne room, the words whispered behind another's back when the music stopped. Even laughter could be dangerous if it came at the wrong moment in the wrong tone. Every man in the court carried a blade not always made of bronze or iron, but of rumour, suggestion and suspicion. Still, to walk those halls was to feel untouchable. From his chamber, Mithridates could look upon the hanging gardens, the torchlit processions, the endless lines of servants bowing with trays of delicacies. He could breathe the air of triumph after a battle, one feel the thrill of being near the pulse of empire. He lived surrounded by the very symbols of eternity, walls painted with God's carpets, woven with patterns that echoed infinity. The king's image cast larger than life in every chamber. What fate could possibly pierce such grandeur? It is this contrast that makes his story unbearable. For the same man who once tasted wine sweetened with pomegranate would soon be forced to swallow milk until it curdled in his stomach. The same man who once perfumed himself with oils of frankincense would be smeared with honey, not as luxury, but as bait. His fall was not just from life into death, it was from silken paradise into a swamp that stank of rot and waste. And that is what makes this tale linger like smoke in history, the cruel irony of how quickly heaven becomes hell. The moment of ruin did not begin with chains. It began with words. Simple words, born not of treachery, but of pride, whispered over cups of wine after a battle that shook an empire. The year was 401 BC, and the battlefield had been Cunaxa. Cyrus, the younger brother to King Artaxerxes II, had risen in rebellion, daring to claim the throne. The clash was brutal, a storm of bronze and blood beneath the Persian sun. In the chaos, it was said that Cyrus himself fell by a single blow, a wound that ended his bid for power and secured the throne for Artaxerxes. But who had struck that blow? In the confusion, no one could say with certainty. And here is where Mithridates sealed his fate. In the glow of victory among comrades and lesser nobles, perhaps drunk, perhaps careless, he claimed it for himself. He boasted that it was his spear that found Cyrus' body, his strike that decided the crown. Such words might have passed unnoticed in another court, in another kingdom. But in Persia, where the king's glory was sacred, the claim was poison. To suggest that a mere courtier, not the great king himself, had ended the rebellion was to chip away at the image of divine authority. Even if Mithridates meant it only as bravado, the rumour could spread like wildfire. And whispers were more dangerous than swords. Soon murmurs reached Artaxerxes' ears. Perhaps his advisers bent the truth, eager to display loyalty. Perhaps jealous rivals of Mithridates stoked the flames, presenting his boast not as loyalty, but as arrogance. He takes for himself what belongs only to you, they might have whispered. He steals your triumph. He diminishes your majesty. The irony is sharp. Mithridates had spoken in admiration, eager to bind his name to the king's victory, but in doing so, he committed the most unforgivable sin, overshadowing the sovereign. In courts where power is absolute, there is no greater crime than appearing too close to the sun. Imagine Mithridates in those days after his word spread. Perhaps he still walked proudly through the palace, unaware that shadows lengthened behind him. Perhaps friends began to avoid his gaze, their smiles a little tighter, their greetings a little shorter. He might have noticed the glances servants who bowed too quickly, fellow courtiers who whispered as he passed. The air thickened with suspicion, and though no one spoke it openly, the trap had already begun to close. The seeds of doom are often small, not a betrayal on the battlefield, not a dagger in the dark, but a single boast over wine. That is how it begins, with pride, with envy, with silence from those who once laughed beside you. By the time Mithridates realized the danger, his fate was already decided, not by swords, but by words sharper than steel. The summons came quietly. No guards stormed his chamber in the night, no shouting or clamour. Instead, a messenger bowed low, his voice smooth as silk. "The king requests your presence," a command but wrapped in the velvet of courtesy. Mithridates, accustomed to such summons, may have thought little of it at first. He rose dressed and followed as he had done many times before. Yet as the corridor stretched longer, as the torches burned lower, he must have felt the air grow colder around him. The palace, once a place of music and perfume, now seemed like a labyrinth leading him to something unseen. Courtiers did not meet his eye. Servants shrank into corners. It was as though the whole palace knew what awaited him, save for the man himself. Only when the path turned away from the throne room did the truth sink in. He was not being led to the king's audience, he was being led to judgment. The chamber he entered was bare, stripped of all ornament, lit only by a single brazier that cast long twitching shadows on the walls. Soldiers flanked the room, their spears glinting red in the firelight. There was no throne here, no grandeur, only authority in its rawest, coldest form. His name was spoken not as welcome, but as accusation. The boast, the words at Cunaxa. The claim that he had struck Cyrus, it was repeated back to him, each syllable sharpened like a blade. There was no time to defend himself, no room for explanation. To the great king, the issue was never guilt or innocence. It was pride. It was order. Mithridates had stolen what could not be stolen, the glory of the king. For that, no excuse mattered. The moment of collapse was sudden and absolute. Soldiers stepped forward. Heavy hands seized him, stripping away his fine robes, his jewelled belt, the dignity that had once clothed him. Chains bit into his wrists. The air that once smelled of myrrh now stank of smoke and iron. The courtier, the noble, the favoured man of fortune, was gone in an instant, replaced by a prisoner. Imagine the panic rising in his chest as he realized the machinery of royal justice had already been set in motion. There was no trial in the true sense, no appeal, no chance to sway the king with pleas. The decision had been made long before he walked into that chamber. The guards did not jeer, they did not gloat, they simply obeyed their silence, more damning than words. And the sentence was unlike any he could have imagined. Not the swift blade of an executioner, not the public spectacle of crucifixion, but something whispered about in fearful tones, the boats. A punishment so infamous that even to speak its name was enough to turn faces pale. The trap had closed, and there was no turning back. Mithridates had crossed an invisible line. And now he would learn what it meant to fall into the hands of a king who ruled not only with power, but with cruelty, refined into art. The cell was small, airless, and damp. Its stones sweated with moisture, the air heavy with the stink of mildew and unwashed bodies. For Mithridates, who once dined beneath gilded ceilings and slept on silken cushions, it was as though the world itself had shrunk to a coffin of stone. The chains clinked each time he shifted an iron lullaby, reminding him of his fall. In that suffocating silence time, no longer moved by hours or days, but by the beat of his own frightened heart. At first, he clung to hope. Perhaps this was temporary, a misunderstanding that could be cleared by reason or loyalty. He told himself the king had always known him, trusted him, smiled upon him. Surely Artaxerxes would hear him out. Surely. But the silence of his cell offered no comfort. No advocate came, no friend spoke on his behalf. The courtiers who once raised their cups with him were gone, their absence louder than any accusation. In a palace ruled by suspicion, silence was betrayal, and betrayal was survival. The guards who brought him food did not answer his questions. Their faces were masks, indifferent, as though he were already dead. Sometimes he caught their smirks exchanged as they slid the tray inside scraps of breadwater that stank of rust. It was not cruelty, but worse amusement, as if they knew what awaited him and savoured the knowledge. Mithridates asked, pleaded, demanded, but no one told him. Only fragments of rumour drifted through the cracks the boats. The words meant little at first. What boats? What river? But as whispers spread from guard to prisoner, from prisoner to guard. Their faces pale, he began to understand. Scaphism. The punishment no one dared describe in full, but which all knew was worse than any other. Not quick, not even slow, but endless, a death that was not an act, but a process stretched beyond imagination. Nights in that cell grew unbearable. He could not sleep. The straw beneath him was damp, crawling with vermin, each touch of their legs against his skin, a reminder of what might come. He pressed his eyes shut, but his mind conjured visions, his body trapped insects, feasting the sun, baking him until he begged for death. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his throat raw from screaming at shadows that answered with silence. In those days of waiting, despair hollowed him out more than hunger or thirst. The true cruelty was not yet the boats themselves, but the anticipation, the dread that gnawed at him like teeth in the dark. He realized that he was already being consumed by fear, by isolation, by the knowledge that every breath brought him closer to a death so horrifying it could only have been invented by men who understood suffering as spectacle. The descent into darkness is not only physical, it is the slow erosion of hope until even the thought of mercy feels like mockery. By the time Mithridates was led from that cell, he was no longer the proud courtier who had boasted of a fatal blow. He was a man already broken, already condemned in mind, long before his body met its fate. When Mithridates was finally led from his cell, it was not to freedom, nor even to a genuine tribunal, but to a performance. The Persians called it justice, but what unfolded was theatre staged for the benefit of power. His wrists were bound, his steps faltering as guards pushed him forward into a chamber where torches smoked and shadows swayed across the walls. At the centre sat not a judge, but a scribe, his reed pen poised to record not truth, but what had already been decided. Before him stood a handful of courtiers' men. Mithridates once knew their robes heavy with jewels, their eyes carefully blank. They did not look at him as a man, but as an inconvenience to be erased. Each had been summoned to play their part. The accusations began softly, then gathered force. They recited his boast, the words he had spoken after Cunaxa, that he had struck Cyrus, that the king's triumph was owed to his hand. To any ear untainted by politics, the words would have seemed no crime at all. They might even have been flattery to remind the court that Mithridates had stood loyally in the battle, a servant of the king. But here, twisted under the weight of suspicion, the words were made poison. False witnesses stepped forward, rehearsed in their lies. They spoke of treachery, of arrogance, of a man who sought to place himself above his sovereign. Their voices were smooth, practiced, betraying no hesitation. And in the silence that followed, no friend of Mithridates rose to contradict them. The men who once laughed at his jokes, who once clapped him on the back during feasts, now stared at the floor, unwilling to gamble their lives on loyalty. This was the facade of justice, not a search for truth, but a ritual to sanctify cruelty. The great king himself did not need to appear. His silence was enough. By remaining absent, Artaxerxes turned the entire proceeding into an echo of his will. No verdict was asked, no defense allowed. The outcome had been etched into stone the moment Mithridates' boast reached the royal ear. The sentence was pronounced with a chill detachment. He would suffer the punishment reserved for traitors and blasphemers, for those who threatened the divine order of the throne. Scaphism. The word itself was a death knell. Gasps rippled through the chamber, for all knew what it meant, yet none dared speak of it aloud. Mithridates felt the weight of that silence fall upon him heavier than any chain. Imagine standing there, stripped of voice of dignity, while the faces you once trusted pretended not to see your fear. Imagine knowing that the entire ritual was a mask, that nothing you could say or do would alter your fate. The trial was not for him, but for them to reassure the court that power was unassailable, that no man could steal even a shadow of the king's glory. And so the record was sealed. The scribe's pen scratched the final strokes not of justice, but of condemnation. Mithridates was led away. His fate decided, his last thread of hope severed. What awaited him was not death, but a descent into a nightmare designed to outlast flesh, to turn a man into a living warning carved into the memory of all who watched. The night before the sentence was carried out, Mithridates lay awake in the silence of his cell. Sleep no longer came to him, only a drifting half-consciousness, broken by the scrape of rats in the corners, the groan of timber in the ceiling above. He knew these were his last hours outside the horror of the boats. Time, once meaningless in prison, had regained its weight pressing down on him with every tick of his pulse. He thought perhaps of what he had lost. The marble halls where he once walked proudly, the gardens perfumed with roses, the laughter of companions now silent in betrayal. Did he remember the feasts, where wine ran like rivers, or the soft touch of a lover's hand? Or did his mind retreat further back to childhood, when death was only a word spoken in hushed tones? No one can say. But every condemned man, when stripped of power, becomes the same small vulnerable clinging to memory, as though memory itself might shield him. At dawn, the guards came not with cruelty, but with ritual. He was given food, though it was not the stale bread or brackish water of his imprisonment. Instead, they brought bowls of milk and honey. The sweetness filled the air thick and cloying. To a starving man, it might have seemed mercy, a final gift before death. But Mithridates had learned too well that nothing in this sentence was mercy. Each mouthful was forced upon him more than his body could bear, until he gagged on the richness, his stomach bloated and aching. He understood at last that this was not kindness but preparation. Imagine the taste of honey turning bitter on your tongue, knowing it was meant not to comfort you, but to lure your executioners of another kind, the flies, the worms, the crawling things that would claim your flesh. Imagine the humiliation of being force-fed, not for life, but for death. It was the perverse mirror of a feast, a banquet where he alone was the dish to be served. They did not allow him words of farewell. No letter was permitted, no message carried beyond the prison walls. Whatever thoughts he wished to send to loved ones died with him in that cell unspoken. Even his final gaze upon the sky was stolen from him. When the guards dragged him from the chamber, the sun was rising pale and golden, casting its light across the stone courtyard. It should have been beautiful, a vision to hold in his mind, but to Mithridates it was the cruelest reminder this sunrise, so ordinary to others, was his last as a man. For a moment, bound and trembling, he may have closed his eyes and begged the gods Ahura Mazda, Mithra Anahita for deliverance. But the heavens remained silent. The sun rose, the city stirred, and the king's sentence marched forward. And so Mithridates was carried into the day that would strip him of everything, his dignity, his body, even his humanity. The boats awaited him. 2 hollowed planks of wood, shaped to fit the curve of a man's body. Crude, ordinary things, yet together they formed an instrument of torment, so refined that even the most hardened soldier paled at its mention. Mithridates was stripped naked, laid upon the lower shell, his limbs stretched and pinned so he could not move. Then the second boat was lowered atop him, enclosing his body like a coffin, split in half. Only his head, his hands and his feet protruded exposed to the open air. The ritual began. More bowls of milk and honey were forced down his throat until his stomach churned and bile rose in his throat. He coughed, gagged, vomited, yet they pressed more into him until he could no longer resist. His body overloaded betrayed him, releasing itself into the narrow space between the wooden shells. The smell came quickly. Sweetness curdled by sickness, honey thickening with waste. And as if summoned, the first flies appeared darting through the air, settling eagerly upon his skin. Then came the smearing. His face, his hands, his feet were painted with honey, each stroke deliberate as though he were being anointed for some grotesque sacrament. The guards stepped back, and already the insects swarmed. They gathered at his lips, crawled into his nostrils, sought the moisture at the corners of his eyes. Ants marched in neat lines along the wood bees, buzzed angrily about his ears, and in the stagnant air of the marsh, where he was set adrift. Gnats and mosquitoes rose in clouds. The sun was merciless. Its heat baked his skin, swelling it until blisters rose and split. Each bead of sweat drew more insects. They stung, they bit, they burrowed into the smallest wounds. By nightfall, his flesh crawled with life that was not his own. The boats were wedged into reeds along the marsh's edge, where stagnant water lapped against them, foul with rot. From beneath, more creatures came, leeches attaching to his feet, worms wriggling toward the waste that leaked from him. Day blurred into day, but the cruelty of scaphism was its duration. It was not meant to kill swiftly. Each dawn, Mithridates awoke to fresh torment, his body refusing to die. His mind drifted in fever, yet consciousness returned again and again to meet the crawling, the gnawing, the endless buzzing that filled his ears until he could hear nothing else. His screams grew hoarse, then broke into whispers until even words abandoned him. But the insects did not. They worked patiently, ceaselessly, as though time itself had become their ally. By the 7th day, the boats were alive with motion, their seams writhing as maggots fattened on his flesh. By the 10th, the stench could be smelled long before one reached the marsh, a reek that turned the stomach and yet drew curious onlookers. By the 15th, his body had become something unrecognizable, a hive, a nest, a grotesque landscape of sores and crawling vermin. And still he breathed. It was said that Mithridates endured 17 days, 17 dawns of fire, and 17 nights of crawling silence before his body finally yielded to what his mind had begged for all along. He died not as a man, but as a monument to cruelty, the victim of a death so calculated, so lingering, that history itself could not forget it. When at last Mithridates' chest stopped rising, when the faint rattle of his breath finally fell into silence, the swamp grew strangely still. The insects did not stop. They continued their mindless feast, crawling in and out of the shell that once held a man. But the cries, the whimpers, the sound of human life, those were gone. What remained was a husk adrift among reeds, more carrion than corpse, the last trace of humanity extinguished. The guards who had watched for days did not weep, nor did they cheer. They exchanged weary glances, as men do when a long, unpleasant duty has ended. To them, Mithridates was never meant to be pitied. He was a lesson carried out to its conclusion. The cruelty was the point. Now, with that purpose fulfilled, he was only refused to be disposed of. Some curious souls had crept to the marshes' edge during the execution, lured by morbid fascination. They had whispered among themselves, covered their noses with cloth, and stared with eyes wide at the horror. But once the body ceased to stir, once the spectacle ended, they began to disperse. There is no drama in death, only the weight of what lingers after. The crowd thinned until only the buzzing swarm bore witness. The order came quietly. The boats were to be dragged back from the reeds and left to rot. What remained of Mithridates' skin, ruptured bones, softened organs liquefied, was unfit even for burial. No tomb would bear his name. No stone would mark his resting place. He had been erased, not only by death, but by deliberate humiliation. The Persians believed the punishment of scaphism did more than kill the body. It annihilated memory, leaving nothing behind but revulsion. And so he slipped into silence. His remains were cast aside, perhaps burned, perhaps left to sink into the muck where he had suffered. No priest recited prayers. No mourner came in secret to honour him. Even his enemies felt no triumph, only the hollow satisfaction of seeing the king's will carried out. It was the silence of power, cold and absolute. But silence can be louder than screams. In that stillness, the true cruelty of the act revealed itself. For a sword stroke ends in a heartbeat, a crucifixion fades in hours. But this, the boats, lingered like a shadow across every courtier's mind. They remembered not only that Mithridates was gone, but how he had gone. And in remembering, they understood the king's reach extended even into death, and his wrath could strip away not just life, but dignity, identity, even memory itself. The swamp remained buzzing with flies, stinking of decay. The executioners left the courtiers, returned to their feasts. The empire continued its rhythms. Yet, beneath the surface, something hung in the air, an absence, an echo, a silence heavier than sound. Mithridates was gone, but the horror of his end would whisper long after his body was dust. History is often written by victors, but sometimes it is carried forward by victims, those who suffered so greatly that their pain became impossible to forget. Mithridates should have been a name lost in the endless roll of Persian courtiers, one of countless men who lived and died in the shadow of a throne. And yet his fate survived in memory, recorded by Greek historians, whispered through centuries, because of the manner in which he was destroyed. He became immortal, not for triumph, but for torment. The Greeks, horrified by what they learned, gave it a name that still chills the tongue: scaphism, the boats. They described it not as punishment, but as theatre, a spectacle so depraved it seemed less the invention of men than of demons. To them, it was proof of Persian cruelty, a weapon in their endless rivalry with the empire. Yet whether the tale was embellished or not, one truth cannot be denied. Someone suffered long enough, terribly enough, that the memory endured. And that memory was Mithridates. There is an irony here, cruel and bitter. His boast spoken in pride was meant to tie his name to victory, to bind him forever to the defeat of Cyrus. In a sense, it succeeded. His name did live on, but not in glory, not in songs, not in the golden inscriptions of kings. Instead, his name became shackled to suffering, forever entwined with the most nightmarish death ever conceived. His immortality was written in screams, not triumphs. And yet, beyond the horror, his story raises a deeper question. What does it mean when power must enforce itself with cruelty, so elaborate, so prolonged, that death itself becomes a tool of art? What does it say of kingdoms that survival depends not on loyalty, but on fear? In scaphism, we see the true face of tyranny, not the crown or the sword, but the silence of courtiers, too afraid to speak the laughter of guards, who serve cruelty because it is easier than resistance. Mithridates' death is not only the story of one man. It is the story of what happens when pride collides with power, when human life becomes expendable in the machinery of empire. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that civilization, with all its marble palaces and golden feasts, often hides its darkest inventions just beneath the surface. The very same society that built gardens in the desert also devised a death that lasted 17 days. Centuries have passed. Empires have risen and fallen. But the question lingers like a shadow at the edge of firelight if cruelty so refined could exist. Then what cruelties exist now, dressed in new names, hidden behind new masks? And so, the tale of Mithridates does not end in the marsh where his body rotted. It ends here in memory, in the echo of his suffering, carried across time. A whisper, a warning, a question that unsettles every age: how far will power go to protect itself, and how much of our humanity will we sacrifice before we notice it slipping away?